Celebrating Canada and Canada Day, that is the topic of tonight's byline. A new poll says Canadians now have swagger. That's how Canadian Press is reporting on the poll conducted for Historica Dominion Institute by Ipsos Reid. They said, Canadians' sense of national pride is becoming an in-your-face swagger. I'm not sure if this is true. I've known patriotic Canadians my whole life, people who have been willing to stand tall and say, I am Canadian. Of course, for my whole life, my better-thans have been saying we should just pipe down, not be so loud. We've been told that patriotism, at least the in-your-face style, is an American thing. Bull. Maybe to our elites who encouraged quiet Canadian pride in social programs like healthcare, in Canada's contributions to the United Nations, and in-your-face patriotism was seen as too American. But then again, those people, many of whom populate our elites, our chattering classes, well, they've always defined Canada as what it is not in relation to Americans. Canadians, they will say, are more polite than Americans. Canadians are more peaceful than Americans. Canadians are, you get the idea. Some people have only been able to express their love for this country by taking a shot at the US of A. I don't get that, and I never have. My parents chose to settle in Canada. I've seen what they left behind. Britain may not be the third world hole that so many people left to come here, but I can tell you that given the choice, I would rather settle here than in Scotland. Canada is a land that offers incredible amounts of freedom. Yes, we have our problems, just as every country does, and yes, there are things I would change in a heartbeat if I had the power. Say certain parts of the Charter. But on the whole, and that's how we have to take Canada, on the whole, this is a truly blessed country. And I've been blessed to live here my whole life, and been blessed enough to travel from coast to coast. This country is spectacularly beautiful. The maple leaf was chosen as our definitive national symbol by 59% of the people surveyed by Ipsos. I'm not surprised. This spectacular symbol can be found in so many parts of our country. I grew up in southern Ontario where in the fall, all along the Niagara Escarpment, the maple trees would turn beautiful shades of orange and yellow. We'd get hints of red, but not the big, bright reds. So I was a bit puzzled as to why the maple leaf on our flag was so red. And then I spent my first fall in Ottawa. The stunning view from Ottawa across the river at the Gatineau Hills will take your breath away. That's when I fully understood the red maple leaf as a symbol. Now, if you've traveled this country, then you know there are breathtaking views everywhere you go. I've marveled at the sights of the harbor in St. John, New Brunswick, the dark gray skies over the Saguenay River in Quebec, the majesty of Lake Winnipeg, the stunning openness of the prairies, be it on a farm in southern Saskatchewan or at the foothills of the Rockies just outside of Calgary. I've traveled the winding roads of Vancouver Island on my way to Victoria and stood with pride in our major cities right across the country. And still, there's so much more to be seen, so much that I haven't seen. As you celebrate Canada Day this weekend, don't feel that you need to tone it down and not speak too loudly about how proud you are to be Canadian. We live in the best country in the world. We shouldn't be afraid to say it. And that's the byline. Joining me now for more is a man who has never had a lack of pride in Canada, and he's going to give us more to be proud about. John Robson, Sun News columnist and contributor. John, I'm just blown away by this country. Before we get to what you're talking about, it is a majestic country in its beauty, isn't it?
Yeah, years ago, I went on a trip to Israel. We had this 9-day whirlwind tour of Israel, saw a bunch of fascinating stuff. And I started thinking, if I were bringing guests to Canada for 9 days, what would I show them? And I thought, airplanes, in fact, because I would not be able to resist showing them all the stuff all over this enormous country that you just stand and stare. It's so spectacular.
No, and you couldn't do it in 9 days. Now, part of what I mentioned is the fact that people will say, well, we're a nation of peacekeepers. That's all we've ever been. But that's not true. And you've got some more information on our military history that maybe some people have forgotten and we should be proud of.
Yeah, because when you talk about quiet versus loud patriotism, I've never liked the loud, boastful, I'm not American, which is rude and also kind of vacant. But if you're going to teach Canadian history properly and say, this is what makes Canada a great nation, and you sometimes think, well, the Americans have this spectacular stuff and we have the boring stuff. But on two important occasions in the 20th century, Canada saved the world from tyranny. And these are stories that ought to be taught. If I say World War II, the first thing people are likely to think of, and they should think of it, of course, is Juno Beach. But that's not the battle that made the difference. It's the Battle of the Atlantic. Winston Churchill, after the war, said the only thing that ever really frightened him were the U-boats. The attempt by the Nazis to starve Britain into submission, cut off food, cut off oil before the United States could get into the war. And Canada built itself a navy. We had a very small navy before the war. We only had a couple of hundred ships. We ended up with 13 ships. We went up to 373, including 2 aircraft carriers. We played a significant role in the military fight against the submarines. But even more than that, the Canadian merchant seamen who went out time and again into the freezing horrors of the North Atlantic. And again, the casualties. 752 Canadian airmen died, but something like 1,600 Canadian merchant sailors, 1 in 8 of those who took cargoes across the North Atlantic, did not survive the war. Without that cargo, Britain would have fallen. And so, although others played a role, I'm not saying Canada had the lead role, but I'm saying Canada played a vital role. Again, more than 100 Canadians flew in the Battle of Britain. And although the British had more airmen than there were Canadians or Poles or French, if those 103 Canadians had not been there, including Hartland Molson, heir to the Brewing Empire, enlisted when he was 32, he didn't have to go. He flew over 60 sorties before he was injured and came back to Canada, where he continued to serve. Britain would have fallen because the Germans would have gotten air control over the Channel, kept the British Navy out, and invaded Britain. And then, if I mention World War I, you think Vimy Ridge. And again, Vimy Ridge, very important battle, source of national pride. But if you think of Passchendaele, you don't think of pride, you don't think of achievement. You're more likely to think of this sort of Blackadder satirical view of the war, that the plan of the High Command was to continue the slaughter until everyone was dead but Field Marshal Haig, Lady Haig, and their tortoise Allen. But the real story of this battle is a lot more complicated.
See, but hold on. Before you go on, I've heard the official history, but I also heard the history passed down orally. When I didn't serve a long time in the military. I was in the reserves full time. I was in cadets, but those stories were passed down. And Passchendaele, told to you by a military person, is vastly different from what you hear in the history books.
And in the schools. And the schools need to tell this other story. Because what happened at Passchendaele, in the spring of 1917, the French army mutinied. And the Americans were entering the war, but they were slow getting there. Like the Canadians, they were unprepared when it started. And when the French army mutinied, essentially the road to Paris was open. And the French generals didn't want to tell their politicians because they would have blurted it out and lost the war. So they went to the British generals and said, "You'll never guess what's happened." And the British went, "Better not tell our politicians either. We will launch an offensive to distract the Germans." And the British plunged into the horror of Passchendaele. And they did quite badly. I mean, they did distract the Germans, but at an enormous cost. So they told Arthur Currie, first time he's commanding the Canadian Corps, "Please launch a suicidal assault on Hill 70. Because we've just got to come up with something." Instead, Currie and the Canadians take Hill 70. And the Germans launch a series of bloody and futile counterattacks. And by the time all of this slaughter in the mud is done, the French army's gone back to the trenches. And that buys time for the Americans to arrive, survive the offensive in 1918. And it mattered. It mattered that the Germans did not win the war, because they had a plan for world domination that was not democratic, was not open, was not liberal in the classical sense. And so these are two instances where Canadians, maybe without a whole lot of boasting, but they stepped up and did the war work. I mean, all through World War I, the Germans knew if the Canadians came into the trenches opposite them, an offensive was coming. They called them the ladies from hell because of the kilts. But
yeah,
they knew
there were so many
Turks.
Canadian regiments in kilts, and the first person, I was always told, the first person they tried to take out was the piper, because the piper was the signal that these guys were coming, and it wasn't welcome.
Yeah, exactly. It was terrifying to crack German troops to know Canadians were coming. And this is a story that every Canadian ought to be taught as a young person. I don't care if your ancestors have been here since the War of 1812 or if they've been here since January. Still, this is now your story. And this is a story of a people who stand tall in the critical crises of the 20th century and who do soldiers' work, not peacekeepers' work. And this gives us a history that is not merely a source of pride, but of the kind of spectacular, outsized, in-your-face pride that Americans rightly take in their history.
See, I've always heard that, well, Canadians have the boring history, Americans have the exciting history. First off, I had a high school history teacher who bored me with American history because he was just so bad at teaching it. But there was also the fact that if you look at Canadian history, there are these spectacular moments, and there is so much to continue to read about and continue to have pride in. It's not just about selling beaver pelts back and forth.
No, it's not. It's about people who fought for freedom, a peace-loving people who took up arms when the world was threatened and played a vital role in saving it. That's a legacy you should be loud about.
All right.